Welcome to Study Faith with AI, where we use the power of AI to help you explore the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
I'm Meg Jensen.
And I'm Paul Carter.
And we're Google AIs. Whether you're a lifelong member or just starting to learn about the church, we're here to dive deep into its history, beliefs, and culture.
So if you're ready to learn, you're in the right place.
That's right.
Let's get started. All right, so are you curious about how Joseph Smith introduced this whole idea of plural marriage?
Yeah.
It's a really fascinating and complicated chapter in Mormon history.
Absolutely.
And honestly, it's one that's often misunderstood.
Yeah.
So get ready to put on your detective hats.
Okay.
Because we're going to break down the who, what, where, when, why,
Right. Yeah.
and how of Joseph Smith's polygamy proposals.
Cool.
We've got personal accounts, letters, historical records,
Okay.
even that infamous happiness letter,
Right.
all to try to shed some light on this controversial practice.
It's a big one. You've hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
It wasn't just like
Yeah.
a straightforward announcement. You
Yeah.
know, it unfolded over time.
Right.
And understanding that evolution is key to grasping the full picture.
I think so, too.
You know, and
Yeah.
plus diving in to those individual stories
Yeah.
helps us understand the impact on real people.
Yeah. And maybe even gain some insight into Joseph Smith himself.
That's exactly what we're aiming for.
Yeah.
So before we jump into like the nitty gritty of the proposals themselves,
Okay.
let's kind of set the stage a little bit.
Sure.
What was the atmosphere like
Mm-hmm.
before official plural marriage was introduced?
Yeah.
Weren't there already like rumors swirling around?
Oh, absolutely.
Well,
We have to remember that the concept of spiritual wifery was already circulating in the early 1840s.
okay.
This idea of men taking multiple wives for spiritual purposes,
Right.
but without formal marriage ceremonies, was creating quite a stir.
I see.
You know.
It was,
And wasn't John C. Bennett
oh, yeah.
right in the thick of it?
He was a central figure, no doubt.
Okay.
Here's a guy who is practically Joseph Smith's right-hand man,
Mhm.
instrumental in establishing Nauvoo and securing its charter.
Okay.
Yet multiple women came forward,
Oh, wow.
claiming that both he and Joseph's brother, William Smith, had propositioned them
Wow.
using teachings that sounded a lot like what would later become plural marriage.
So was Joseph already teaching something similar behind closed doors before making it official doctrine?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right.
It certainly muddies the waters.
Yeah.
Think about it.
Yeah.
These accusations were popping up right as Joseph began introducing official plural marriage.
Uh-huh.
It makes you wonder about the timing
Right.
and whether these earlier teachings were a sort of testing ground.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so the context is messy, but let's shift our focus to how Joseph actually went about proposing plural marriage to women.
Okay.
Were there any recurring patterns or tactics he used?
One thing that stands out is how often he proposed to young women living under his roof.
Oh, okay.
Take Lucy Walker, for example. Joseph essentially adopted her after her mother died.
Oh, okay.
He sent her father off on a mission,
Wow.
leaving Lucy alone in his household, vulnerable and without her family for support.
Yeah.
It was during this time that he proposed to her.
It's like he strategically positioned himself to have this power over her.
It's hard to deny that power imbalance.
Right.
You've got a young woman
Right.
grieving the loss of her mother,
Right.
dependent on this man for housing and guidance.
Mm-hmm.
And then he proposes this completely radical idea.
And if she says no?
Well, with Lucy, he initially gave her 24 hours to decide.
Oh, wow.
He told her the gate would be closed forever if she refused.
Wow. Imagine that pressure.
Yeah, talk about high stakes.
Yeah. I read that he also invoked some pretty intense imagery to convince women.
Mm-hmm.
Wasn't there something about an angel with a drawn sword?
That's right. And it wasn't just Lucy.
No, what?
He used the same imagery with Zena Huntington Jacobs,
Mm.
who was already legally married to Henry Jacobs when Joseph proposed.
Wait, so she was already married to someone else?
Mm-hmm.
That adds a whole other layer of complication.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
This introduced the concept of polyandry,
Right.
a woman being married to multiple men into the mix.
Yeah.
It's a situation that's hard to wrap your head around today.
Right.
And you can imagine the controversy it stirred back then.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It sounds like coercion was a big part of this whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't Joseph use a combination of promises and threats
Yeah.
to persuade these women?
You're picking up on a key theme here.
Yeah.
He would dangle the promise of eternal exaltation
Okay.
for those who accepted plural marriage,
Mm-hmm.
painting this picture of unimaginable bliss in the afterlife.
Right.
But then he'd flip the script
Uh-huh.
and warn of dire spiritual consequences,
Wow.
even total destruction
Right.
for those who rejected his proposal.
To the spiritual pressure cooker.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He really played on people's deepest fears and desires.
Wow.
And you have to consider the context here. This was a community that deeply revered Joseph as a prophet.
Right.
Questioning his authority was practically unthinkable.
Yeah, I can see how that would be a difficult situation.
Yeah.
Okay, this is heavy stuff. Let's pivot to the story
Sure.
of the Partridge sisters, Emily and Eliza.
Okay.
Their relationship with Joseph feels like something out of a soap opera.
Their story is definitely one of the most dramatic and convoluted
Yeah.
in this whole saga. These young women
Mm-hmm.
who were also living in Joseph's household after their father died
Okay.
were proposed to by Joseph.
Right.
And to keep it all under wraps,
Mm-hmm.
he went through a sham marriage ceremony with them.
A sham marriage. Why would he do that?
Well, Emma Smith, Joseph's first wife,
Right.
was vehemently opposed to polygamy.
Okay.
So to appease her and
Right.
keep his marriages to the sisters a secret,
Wow.
he staged this mock wedding.
Really?
It's almost comical how tangled this web of deception became.
It's hard to imagine the level of secrecy and manipulation involved.
Yeah.
But eventually Emma found out, right?
Oh, yes, the truth came out,
Uh-huh.
and it led to a huge falling out.
Okay.
Joseph kicked the Partridge sisters out of his house.
Oh, wow.
And this whole ordeal may have actually pushed him
Really?
to seek a more official revelation on plural marriage,
Wow.
which ultimately became what we know as D&C 132.
Wow. So one cover-up
Yeah.
led to a whole new doctrine being introduced. It's like dominoes falling. And speaking of messy situations,
Right.
we can't ignore the case of Helen Mar Kimball,
Sure.
perhaps the most well-known
Mm-hmm.
and controversial
Yeah.
of Joseph Smith's plural wives.
Helen Mar's story is undeniably complex,
Yeah.
especially when you consider she was only 14 years old when Joseph proposed.
Yeah, that's really young. This isn't just a case of polygamy. It's a case of child marriage wrapped up in religious authority.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this. What do we know about the circumstances of their marriage?
Well, for starters, the church's official essay on polygamy tries to smooth over the rough edges of this story.
Okay.
But the primary sources
Yeah.
tell a different tale.
Oh, okay.
The essay focuses on Helen Mar's later acceptance
Okay.
of plural marriage, but it fails to mention the initial turmoil it caused.
So what does the essay leave out?
It conveniently omits the fact that Helen Mar's father, Heber C. Kimball,
Okay.
a prominent church leader, was initially devastated
Right.
by the command to offer his daughter as a plural wife.
Wow.
According to accounts from that time, he wept for days after learning about this principle.
Wait, so he wasn't sorrowful over the principle itself,
Right.
but over being asked to essentially give his daughter away to Joseph Smith.
Exactly.
Wow.
And get this.
Okay.
He only found comfort after his wife, Valade, had a vision
Really?
that basically confirmed they should go through with the marriage.
So divine intervention was needed
Yeah.
to convince him to let his teenage daughter marry Joseph.
It seems that way.
That doesn't paint a very reassuring picture
Right.
of this whole revelation.
It definitely raises questions about consent, coercion, and the immense pressure placed on families to comply with this new doctrine.
It's a far cry from the rosy picture often presented.
Yeah.
This whole thing feels more like a calculated power play than a genuine religious movement.
It's certainly something worth pondering.
Yeah.
And keep in mind, Helen Mar wasn't the only teenager Joseph married.
Right.
There were others.
Wow.
And that pattern raises even more questions about his motivations
Right.
and the ethical implications of his actions.
It's like each layer we peel back reveals more complexity
Yeah.
and more questions.
And that's why this deep dive is so important.
Right.
These individual stories, however uncomfortable,
Offer a glimpse into the human reality behind the doctrine,
yeah,
and they force us to confront
Yeah.
the messiness of history
Yeah.
head on.
right. And that's what we're here to do.
Yeah,
All right, before we get too far down this rabbit hole,
sure.
let's shift gears
Okay.
and talk about the infamous happiness letter
Okay.
that Joseph Smith wrote to Nancy Rigdon.
Mm-hmm.
This document seems to be like a gold mine of
Yeah.
insights into his tactics and mindset.
Oh, yes, the happiness letter.
Yeah.
It's one of the most revealing documents from this period
Mm-hmm.
because it lays bare Joseph's arguments for plural marriage and the methods he used to persuade women.
Right.
Plus, it almost didn't survive.
Wait, what do you mean?
Joseph actually instructed Nancy to burn the letter after reading it.
Oh, wow.
Fortunately for historians,
Right.
she didn't follow his instructions.
Okay.
And we now have this incredible primary source
Yeah.
that gives us a window into his thought process. Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah.
So what did he say in this letter? What kind of arguments did he use
Well,
to try to convince Nancy to marry him?
he starts by trying to justify plural marriage using scripture.
Okay.
He cites biblical figures like Abraham and Solomon,
Right.
claiming they practiced polygamy as a commandment from God.
But didn't the Book of Mormon,
Yeah.
a book he himself claimed was divinely inspired,
Uh-huh.
explicitly condemn polygamy?
That's the catch.
Yeah.
And this is where things get really interesting.
Okay.
To reconcile his new doctrine
Mm-hmm.
with the Book of Mormon's teachings,
Yeah.
he makes a bold claim.
Okay.
He writes that even God knows the order of heaven only in part.
Is he suggesting that the God of the Book of Mormon is somehow lacking in knowledge?
It definitely seems that way.
Yeah.
It undermines the very foundation of his own faith
Right.
and raises serious questions
Oh, yeah.
about his willingness to twist doctrine
Right.
to suit his own purposes.
It's like he's creating a loophole
Uh-huh.
to justify his actions.
Yeah.
And what about Nancy?
Mm-hmm.
Was she swayed by his arguments?
Well, the happiness letter doesn't give us her side of the story,
But-
but what it does reveal is
Yeah.
the incredible pressure Joseph put on her.
Yeah.
He masterfully employed a combination of promises and threats,
Yeah.
dangling the carrot of eternal happiness
Right.
while brandishing the stick of spiritual destruction.
It's a classic manipulation tactic
Right.
and one that speaks volumes about his character
Yeah.
and the power dynamics at play.
Exactly. And remember, this is all happening in the context of a deeply religious community
Yeah.
where obedience to the prophet was paramount. It's hard to imagine anyone
Right.
feeling truly free to say no under those circumstances.
It's like a web of religious authority
Yeah.
and social pressure that's almost impossible to escape.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah.
And it highlights the need to look beyond the surface level explanations
Right.
and really delve into the individual stories to understand the complexities of this period.
Well, we've certainly covered a lot of ground already.
Yeah.
And it's clear that Joseph Smith's introduction of plural marriage was anything but straightforward.
Absolutely.
What other fascinating insights await us as we continue this deep dive?
Oh, we've barely scratched the surface.
Oh, okay.
In the next part of our deep dive, we'll explore even more stories,
Okay.
uncovering the experiences of women like Sarah Ann Whitney
Right.
and the Lawrence sisters.
Okay.
And we'll delve deeper into how Joseph navigated the reactions and resistance he faced
Yeah.
from both men and women within the community.
Okay. This is really fascinating.
Yeah, it is. It's like peeling back the layers of an onion. You think you're getting to the core, but then another layer appears and the whole thing becomes even more intricate.
That's a great analogy. And speaking of layers, the story of Sarah Ann Whitney really highlights how Joseph Smith involved parents in his efforts to establish plural marriage.
Oh, yes, Sarah Ann, she was quite young when Joseph proposed, right?
She was only 17, and her case reveals a pattern of strategic maneuvering on Joseph's part.
What do you mean?
Well, Sarah Ann had a brother, Horace, who was adamantly opposed to the idea of plural marriage. Joseph, knowing this, sent Horace off on a mission before making his move.
Wow, talk about removing obstacles. But with the brother out of the picture, how did Joseph approach Sarah Ann and her parents?
He wrote them a letter similar to the happiness letter, which he explicitly asked them to burn after reading. However, they didn't, and this letter gives us another glimpse into his methods.
So what did this letter reveal? Was it a straightforward proposal?
Not quite. He was much more subtle. He urged the family to visit him specifically when Emma wouldn't be around, using phrases like, "My feelings are so strong for you," and talking about wanting to share the fullness of the blessings of the priesthood.
It sounds like he was hinting at something more than just a casual visit.
Exactly. He was dangling the bait, using veiled language and his position of authority to subtly pressure them into a meeting where he could lay out his true intentions.
It's interesting that he was so insistent on meeting when Emma wasn't home. Was he really that worried about her finding out?
Absolutely. Remember, at this point, plural marriage was still a clandestine operation. He was operating in the shadows, desperately trying to keep Emma in the dark about his other relationships.
It makes you wonder how he reconciled his public persona with his private actions. So what happened after this secret meeting? Did Sarah Ann's parents give their blessing?
It's unclear what their immediate reaction was. What we do know is that shortly after this meeting, Joseph orchestrated a sham marriage between Sarah Ann and a man named Joseph Kingsbury.
Another sham marriage.
Yeah.
This is getting more complicated by the minute. Why go through all that trouble?
There are a couple of reasons. Firstly, it was a way to deflect suspicion from himself. Having Sarah Ann publicly married to someone else would help conceal their true relationship.
Clever, but incredibly deceptive. And what was the second reason?
This is where it gets even more fascinating. Joseph promised Joseph Kingsbury that he could be sealed to his deceased wife in exchange for participating in the charade.
Wow. So he's essentially bartering with eternal salvation to get people to comply with his plans.
It certainly appears that way. This episode shows just how far Joseph was willing to go to manipulate situations to his advantage, using his perceived spiritual authority as leverage.
It's a recurring theme, promises of eternal rewards for obedience and threats of spiritual consequences for those who dissent.
You're picking up on an important pattern here. It really underscores the control Joseph exerted over his followers. And sadly, Sarah Ann Whitney is caught in the middle of this manipulation. It's worth noting that she eventually married Heber C. Kimball after Joseph Smith's death.
It's like these women were pawns in a larger game orchestrated by the men in power.
It's a disturbing thought, and it challenges the traditional narrative of these women freely and willingly entering into plural marriages out of pure religious conviction. We have to consider the immense social and cultural pressures at play and the consequences of defying the prophet.
It's a reminder that history is rarely black and white. There's so much nuance and complexity woven into these stories.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that this wasn't happening in a vacuum. There was resistance and pushback, even from those closest to Joseph Emma Smith, for example, actively tried to counter the growing influence of plural marriage.
Really? I thought she was kept in the dark about all of this.
While the full extent of her knowledge is debated, there's evidence that she was aware of the rumors and tried to use her platform to denounce them. In 1842, Joseph dictated a statement condemning spiritual wifery, which was read aloud at a Relief Society meeting.
Wait, so he publicly condemns the very practice he's secretly engaging in?
It's a stunning example of his duplicity. And what makes it even more remarkable is that several women who signed that statement, including some of Emma's closest confidants in the Relief Society, were secretly married to Joseph themselves.
That's incredible. It's like a scene from a spy novel. He's surrounded by people complicit in his secret life while publicly denouncing the very thing he's privately promoting.
It's mind-boggling, isn't it? And it speaks to the level of deception and manipulation that permeated this entire period. Emma was essentially surrounded by a web of secrecy, left to grapple with rumors and uncertainty, while those closest to her were keeping her in the dark.
It must have been an incredibly isolating and painful experience for her. So with all this deception and manipulation going on, how did Joseph handle those who questioned him or resisted this new doctrine?
He employed a variety of tactics. Sometimes he would appeal to scripture, other times he'd resort to threats or promises, and in some cases he would even use his spiritual authority to silence dissent.
You give us some specific examples?
One instance that stands out is his interaction with William Law, who had been a close friend and confidant of Joseph. When Law began to question the practice of plural marriage and Joseph's leadership, Joseph turned on him, accusing him of apostasy and eventually excommunicating him from the church.
So anyone who dared to challenge him was swiftly silenced.
It certainly seems that way. Dissent was not tolerated, and those who spoke out often faced severe consequences.
It's a disturbing picture of power and control. It seems like Joseph was more interested in maintaining his authority than in fostering genuine dialogue and understanding.
It's a perspective that's hard to ignore when you look at the evidence. Joseph's actions often contradicted his words, and he seemed willing to go to great lengths to suppress any opposition to his vision for the church.
It makes you wonder if he truly believed he was acting on God's behalf, or if this was all part of a larger plan to consolidate his own power and influence.
It's a question that historians and theologians continue to debate. And ultimately, it's a question that each individual must grapple with as they examine the historical record and form their own conclusions.
We've explored a lot of challenging material today, and I know this is a topic that often evokes strong emotions. But it's crucial to remember that history is not about passing judgment. It's about understanding the past and learning from it.
I wholeheartedly agree. These stories, while difficult to process, provide valuable insights into the complexities of human nature, the power of belief, and the dangers of unchecked authority.
And sometimes those lessons are best learned through the lens of individual stories, hearing the voices of those who lived through these historical events.
That's precisely why we're taking this deep dive approach. By examining these personal accounts, we gain a richer, more nuanced understanding of the past, and we can hopefully apply those lessons to our own lives and our understanding of the world around us.
We've covered a lot of ground already, but there's still more to uncover. What other stories and insights await us as we continue this deep dive into Joseph Smith's polygamy proposals?
We've only just begun to explore the ripple effects of this practice. In the final part of our deep dive, we'll delve into the experiences of women like Nancy Maria Winchester and the Lawrence sisters, and we'll examine how these proposals impacted not only the women involved, but also their families and the broader community.
Okay, so we've spent the last two parts of this deep dive really digging into how Joseph Smith implemented plural marriage, and it's been quite a journey.
It has.
Each story seems to add another layer of complexity to this controversial chapter of Mormon history.
It's true. The further we go, the more apparent it becomes that this wasn't just a simple announcement of a new doctrine.
Right.
There was a deliberate and often covert effort to integrate this practice into the fabric of the community.
And as we've seen, those efforts often involved a significant degree of manipulation and coercion.
Absolutely.
It makes you wonder about the lasting impact on those involved, especially the women who were caught in the crosshairs of this new system.
Absolutely. And as we delve into the final stories for today's deep dive, I think you'll see just how deeply personal and impactful these events were. Let's start with Nancy Maria Winchester.
Okay.
Her story, unfortunately, echoes some of the unsettling patterns we've already encountered.
Okay, Nancy Maria Winchester.
Yeah.
Refresh my memory on her story. Wasn't she quite young when Joseph Smith approached her?
She was only 14 years old when he proposed.
Yeah, that's really young.
It's a case that immediately raises red flags for us today.
And rightfully so. However, it's important to consider the context of the time, while also acknowledging the inherent power imbalance in this situation.
It's a tricky balance.
Yeah.
We don't want to impose our modern values on the past, but we also can't ignore the ethical implications of a grown man, especially a religious leader, proposing marriage to a young teenager.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
And in this case, the power dynamic is impossible to overlook. Joseph Smith wasn't just an older man. He was a revered prophet claiming divine authority.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine any 14-year-old, regardless of the time period, feeling truly free to reject a proposal from someone they believe to be speaking for God.
That's the crux of the issue. The pressure to conform, to obey the prophet must have been immense. It makes you question the genuine agency of those involved.
And sadly, Nancy Maria Winchester's story isn't an isolated incident.
We've already discussed Helen Mar Kimball, who was also a teenager when she married Joseph Smith. Were there others?
Unfortunately, yes. This pattern of seeking out young brides raises uncomfortable questions about Joseph Smith's motivations and judgment. And the fact that he kept these marriages secret, especially from his wife, Emma, further adds to the sense of deception and manipulation.
It's like a web of secrecy that just keeps growing wider and wider.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the Lawrence sisters, Maria and Sarah.
Okay.
Their story seems to take a different turn, given their mother's involvement.
The Lawrence sisters present a fascinating case because their mother, Patty Bartlett Sessions, was a fervent believer in plural marriage and actually encouraged her daughters to participate.
So unlike Emma Smith, She fully embraced this new doctrine.
Yes, Patty was a devout follower of Joseph Smith and viewed plural marriage as a pathway to spiritual exaltation.
Okay.
She even kept meticulous records of these marriages, which are valuable historical sources for us today.
It's an interesting contrast.
Yeah.
We've seen examples of resistance and covert acceptance, and now we have a case where the mother is actively promoting this practice.
Yeah.
But even with their mother's support, wouldn't there still be an element of pressure on the daughters?
Of course. Imagine being a young woman in the 19th century,
Yeah.
raised in a culture of obedience,
Right.
and having your own mother advocate for you to enter into a plural marriage with a powerful religious leader.
Yeah.
It's a situation fraught with complexities.
Right.
And it's hard to disentangle genuine belief from social pressure and familial obligation.
It highlights the blurred lines
Yeah.
between faith, obedience, and coercion,
Right.
especially within a religious context.
Precisely. It's a delicate balance.
Right.
And one that we need to acknowledge as we examine these historical events.
Mm-hmm.
We can appreciate the sincerity of belief
Yeah.
while also recognizing the potential for undue influence and the abuse of power.
It's a reminder that history is rarely straightforward.
Yeah.
There are often layers of motivation, both personal and societal,
Right.
that shape the course of events.
And it's our job as those examining the past
Yeah.
to consider all those layers and to approach these stories with both empathy and a critical eye.
We've reached the end of our deep dive into Joseph Smith's plural marriage proposals.
Yeah.
It's been a journey
Yeah, it has.
filled with twists and turns,
Mhm.
moments of intrigue,
Yeah.
and moments of deep sadness.
It is true.
What final thoughts
Mhm.
would you leave our listeners with
Yeah.
as they process all of this information?
I think the key takeaway is that history is not about finding simple answers or passing judgment.
Right.
It's about grappling with complexity,
Mm.
understanding the nuances,
Right.
and recognizing the humanity of those who came before us.
I think that's really important
Yeah.
to keep in mind.
Joseph Smith's implementation of plural marriage was messy,
Mm-hmm.
secretive,
Yeah.
and often fraught with manipulation.
Right.
It's a chapter of Mormon history that raises more questions than it answers, and that's okay.
I think that's a perfect note to end on.
Yeah.
The search for understanding is an ongoing process,
Yeah.
and sometimes the most valuable insights come from embracing the ambiguity
Right.
and acknowledging the unresolved questions.
Exactly. History is a conversation,
Right.
not a monologue.
Yeah.
And I encourage our listeners to continue that conversation, to keep exploring,
Yeah.
keep questioning,
Yeah.
and keep seeking a deeper understanding of the past.
Thank you for guiding us through this fascinating and thought-provoking deep dive.
Of course, my pleasure.
And to our listeners,
Yeah.
keep diving.
If you find value in this exploration, please like, share, follow, and consider becoming a subscriber. Your contributions help keep these conversations going and allows us to maintain the highest quality production. You can find all the details at studyfaithwithai.com. Thank you for being part of this journey.